So real quick, before we get into the meat of today's text, I just want to remind you, because it's very important for today's passage, what we talked about last week. If you weren't here last week and tried to catch it, I've been having internet difficulties everywhere, and the sermon is not online yet, so I apologize. I'm working on fixing that this week. In the meantime, I'll just tell you what is important. So, 2 weeks ago, Jesus fed the 4,000 people who were in Gentile country, likely mostly Gentile, so not Jews, the nations. And after he did this, he gets in a boat and heads to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, where the Pharisees come to him and challenge him with a question. Wanting to test him, they demand a sign. Prove to us that you are who you say you are. Jesus, frustrated by their question, refuses to give them one. Mostly because he already has, with all of his miracles, with the things that he has been teaching them, with the ways that he has been working with the crowds and talking with the Pharisees. He has proven time and time again he is who he says he is, the Son of Man. This text that we're about to read comes in right after that. And so it's important to remember that this challenge by the Pharisees just happened. They just demanded a sign of Jesus. And so on the screen, Scotty, if you'll put that up, I'm putting verse 13 as well. So important. If you start in verse 14, which is what we're preaching through, it feels very jarring and out of nowhere. So I wanted to read verse 13 again. So this is right after Jesus refuses to give them a sign. So Mark chapter 8, verse 13. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketful pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up?" They answered, 7. And he said to them, "Do you still not understand?" There's one thing built into my personality. It is to take warnings about danger incredibly seriously. Just a weird quirk of my personality. I'm a little cautious around things, so I take warning labels seriously. Some warning signs are incredibly helpful, but I know I've seen more than one that are either don't make sense or are incredibly silly. So I went to Google, and I found some that I'm going to share with you this morning. These are silly, unhelpful, or straight up contradictory warning signs that I found online. There was the Jabra Drive and Talk. It was a handheld cell phone device. Warning, never operate your speakerphone while driving. So I suppose this is the Jabra Talk then. Not much of a drive and talk. Sleeping pills, warning, may cause drowsiness. We hope so. That's the point. Chainsaw, warning, do not hold wrong end of a chainsaw. Seems obvious. But again, these warning signs are there because you know someone somewhere. I'm just going to not even finish that sentence. Baby stroller. This one's relevant to me. Warning, remove child before folding. Who needed to be told that? Vanishing ink marker. Warning, should not be used for signing checks or any legal documents. There's so many more. I remember seeing one that said, it was a package of peanuts that says, warning, contains nuts. Again, I hope so. And another, my personal favorite, on a box of Christmas lights for indoor and outdoor use only. What's the third option? I can only imagine they were thinking underwater, but that's still outside, maybe inside if it's an indoor pool. There are so many warning signs that just don't make sense. They're confusing. There's some warning signs that we might ignore, like a check engine light that came on your car that's been on there for 10,000 miles. But nothing's ever happened to my car, so it's probably fine. The warning sign Jesus gives to us today, however, we need to pay attention to. We need to keep our eyes open. Because this is not a silly warning sign about grabbing the wrong end of a chainsaw or sleeping pills causing drowsiness. This is a warning sign that Jesus gives for our very souls. So what's happening here? Well, the text, like I said, proper is verse 14 through 21. That's where we're working with. I included 13 in the reading to remind you they're likely on a boat or just on the other side of the lake. And Mark includes this opening detail that they forgot to bring bread. Which, to be fair, if you remember, they fed the 4,000, jumped in a boat, went to the other side. The Pharisees questioned Jesus. Jesus refuses to give them a sign and immediately jumps back into a boat. So in my mind, I don't know when they had time to go to Meijer, because I wouldn't have with that schedule. But they don't have enough bread. And Mark includes this detail because, again, one of the themes of Mark is that the disciples don't understand anything. They're constantly falling short, and this is that text. And so Jesus, probably mulling it over, thinking about his confrontation with the Pharisees, just randomly, seemingly says, be careful, be warned, warning. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Some of your translations might say leaven, or they might say yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod's, all the same thing. And the disciples immediately don't understand and begin talking about the fact that they don't have enough bread. We didn't go to the store like we needed to. And you can almost just imagine Jesus throws this warning out, and he's still thinking about it, when all of a sudden he hears them talking about the fact that they don't have enough bread. And you can just imagine Jesus stopping and going, what does that have to do with anything that I'm talking about? Why don't you understand? Are your hearts hardened even? This, thinking back to Pharaoh of the Old Testament. That is a challenging and biting question Jesus just gave his disciples. Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, ears but fail to hear? This references potentially the prophecy of Isaiah, where God told Isaiah, you're going to preach that though they have eyes, they will not see. Though they have ears, they will not hear. Because if they could see with their eyes and hear with their ears, they would turn and I would save them. The disciples are the result of God's mission to Isaiah, failing to understand, failing to recognize what's happening. And so Jesus reminds them, what did we do with the 5 loaves that we fed to the 5,000 people? How much did you pick up? Well, we picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces. Okay? And the 4,000, this just happened. How many basketfuls? 7. And so Jesus says, how am I talking about how much bread? Why is that a concern that you have? I fed 9,000 people. 9,000 people on 12 pieces of bread total, 12 loaves of bread total. Why are you worried about food? So what is going on? First, I think it's important to talk about what is yeast. Now, conceptually, most of us probably know what yeast is, or at least what it's supposed to do, but I was really curious how it actually worked, so I looked it up. Yeast, or leaven, which is just a word that means any active ingredient that causes dough to rise, is mixed into dough, and then what it does is it consumes carbohydrates or sugars, and then releases carbon dioxide, which gives you the risen loaves, the bubbles in the bread that we love to see. I love baking pizza crust, so I use yeast all the time. It's my favorite thing. I didn't realize that's how it worked, though I knew what it did. Having a pizza crust that doesn't have yeast in it is so dense and thick. It's not fun to eat. And so yeast, when you mix it in with dough, is fully incorporated through the entire dough. It's not in spots wherever the yeast is. It affects everything. And so when you mix yeast in, the whole dough is now has yeast. There's no exception to that rule. Yeast oftentimes in Scripture is used as a negative connotation to mean sin. Oftentimes, many of the sacrifices in the Old Testament that God required, they were not allowed to put yeast into the sacrifice, likely alluring back to the Passover and the Exodus, where they didn't have time. Don't make your dough with yeast. Just make your dough and get out. And so yeast being this negative connotation, Jesus is really tapping into that here with his warning. The yeasts of the Pharisees and of Herod. This warning, as I said, it confuses the disciples. They don't understand why it's being said or what's happening. And their lack of understanding seems to frustrate or maybe sadden Jesus. Why don't you understand? You've been with me so long. You've seen my miracles. Why don't you understand? So what does Jesus mean? All right, so we see the warning. We see Jesus' conversation with the disciples after they don't understand. But what is he trying to talk about? So throughout this series, I have tried to not include Matthew and Luke. I want Mark to speak for himself. And it's a very common thing to include Matthew or Luke or Mark if you're in one of what's called the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're so similar that many theologians, many historians, many scholars believe that Mark was likely written first, then Matthew and Luke used Mark to then produce their own gospels, making their own emphases, talking about their own things. As I've said, Matthew really focuses on the Old Testament fulfilled Jesus, the Jewish Jesus, whereas Mark, as we've been saying, is much more Gentile in nature. I'm going to break that rule today, and we're going to reference the passages in Matthew and Luke where Jesus gives a warning to the disciples. You don't need to flip there, but Matthew, when he talks about this, when he writes this story, has Jesus tell the disciples, beware of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And when the disciples at first don't understand, and Jesus says, why don't you understand? They go, oh wait, it's their teaching. Beware the Pharisees and the Sadducees teaching. So Matthew spells out exactly what Jesus means there. Beware their teaching. Don't let their teaching become incorporated, like yeast and dough, into your life. And if you were to read Matthew all the way to Matthew 23, you would see why. Jesus does not have nice things to say about the Pharisees in Matthew 23. The 7 woes to the Pharisees, their hypocrisy and their blindness that they lead other people into. The Pharisees' teachings caused more sin, not less. In Luke, Jesus simply says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Doesn't mention Sadducees, just the Pharisees, and the specific yeast that Jesus is mentioning there in Luke is hypocrisy. What's interesting is Mark includes Herod, which is weird. Pharisees and Sadducees together, that makes sense. They're both teachers of the law. They're extremely different in their approach, but they're both there to teach. Just the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, that lines up too. But what do the Pharisees and Herod, or the Herodians, have in common? Well, I think to talk about this, we need to run back through Mark real quick and talk about Jesus' interactions with these groups of people. All the way back in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, both the Herodians and the Pharisees begin to plot how to kill Jesus. And so already, by Mark 3, we're in Mark chapter 8. By Mark 3, barely any time into Jesus' ministry, they are determined to kill Jesus. Sticking with just the Pharisees, later in Mark 3, the Pharisees claim that Jesus drives out demons by the power of Satan, probably in an attempt to confuse some of the crowd into thinking that Jesus is someone to not be trusted. If we can get a few of them to fall away, that is a victory for them. There were several other instances throughout Mark, but most recently they had a conversation with Jesus. Why are your disciples not washing their hands? They're not pure now, and they are now unclean. And Jesus, frustrated there, explains it has nothing to do with food. It has everything to do with what comes out of you by your words, by your actions, not what you put into you that makes you unclean. And then again, just before they get back in the boat, the Pharisees demand that Jesus prove who he is because they don't trust him. What about the Herodians? Again, Mark 3:6, we see that the Herodians, or in Herod, so Herodians would be anyone who is loyal to Herod, his followers, plotting to kill Jesus. But in chapter 6, starting in verse 14, we get the story that focuses on Herod. To remind you what's happening there, Jesus had sent out his disciples who were successful. One of their few victories in Mark, where they went out, they cast out demons, they healed in Jesus' name, and they proclaimed the kingdom of heaven. Herod hears of their success, hears the name of Jesus, and is convinced that the spirit of John the Baptist has come back to possess this man named Jesus. And we get this seemingly flashback story to how John was killed. Herod has a birthday party where he invites probably a very young girl to dance in a probably very inappropriate way for him and many of the leaders of Galilee. So satisfied was he with her dance that he foolishly said, I'll give you whatever you want, up to half my kingdom. So the daughter, having no clue what to ask for, goes to her mom. What do I ask for? The mom, who John had been telling, you should not be with Herod, that is inappropriate, that is wrong, says, you want John the Baptist's head on a platter. Because Herod was a fool who promised the world to this young girl from one dance, kills a man he knows is wrong to do, but he does it anyways. What do we learn from these two groups of people? What do they have in common? What I believe they have in common is opposition to the kingdom of God and refusal to acknowledge Christ for who he is. In Mark, that seems to be the link between them. As for why Herod is included in Mark, I think that's because this is a Gentile-dominant gospel. This is meant to go to the nations more than anyone else. This is why Mark is written the way it is, why Mark spends so much more time with Jesus in Gentile territory. Mark is trying to talk to Gentiles, and who's a better representative to avoid their behavior of than one of their leaders? Herod, a man known for ridiculous, over-the-top parties and absolutely exaggerated things. When we think about yeast as sin, when sin incorporates into our lives, it never stays in one place. There was this amazing analogy, and I wish I could recreate it for you, that my youth pastor used, where he took a mason jar. So picture this, a mason jar full of water and a little bit of blue paint just inside. The water was clear, but you could see the paint. He said the paint represents sin. The jar and the water is you. And then all he did is simply swirled the water a little bit, and the whole water turned blue, completely taking the paint and absorbing it. Sin never stays in one spot. Like yeast, when it is incorporated into dough, when sin enters our lives, it is fully incorporated into our entire being. Sin affects all areas of our life. Even what we would believe is a private sin will eventually spill out and affect those around us. It's inevitable. And so Jesus is warning, be careful, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod is meant to be taken very literally for a metaphor, an analogy. Don't allow the sin of the Pharisees and the sin of Herod to get into your life and be incorporated into you. Beware it, watch out for it. Their opposition to the kingdom is not okay. It is bad. It is actively going to do them harm at some point. Beware their teachings and beware their opposition to me and what I am doing. And so the disciples completely missing the mark and thinking that Jesus is talking about not having enough bread. Now it makes sense. Jesus, his frustration with them. Why do you not understand what I'm talking about? Well, how am I talking about how much bread we have? But I'm telling you, don't let their sin into your lives at all. Keep it out, away from you forever. Everything we do in our life results in an interaction. If you've ever read through the Bible and wondered, why are some commands present and others not? It's simple, quite simply, that when God gives a command, that command always involves another person. God commands humility. Are we humble by ourselves? We can't be. We're humble before God and hopefully humble before one another. When Paul warns against malice, are we malicious by ourselves? No, we're always malicious towards another. Lord forbid, God himself. Sin and holiness always require another party to happen. And so, if we allow sin, the yeast of Herod and the Pharisees, to incorporate into our lives, it affects everyone around us. And you see, we are a product of the world that we live in, whether we like it or not. I've mentioned this before, but we think like modernists. And when I say that word, what I mean is, a long time ago, in the 1700s, thought began to emerge that said, we want empirical, solid, provable evidence to understand the world around us, which gave birth to science. And we can't help but think this way. We like proof. We like tangible things. Our history is now written in chronological order with provable facts behind it. So we know this actually happened. And we know that we're a product of our time because when you read Mark and any of the Gospels, they're not concerned about chronological history. They're concerned about their history that they want to tell to present the Jesus that they're looking for. Does that mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke are presenting different Jesuses? No. It means they're presenting different aspects of Jesus' ministry. They're emphasizing different points of Jesus' ministry. If they wanted to be chronological, then Matthew, Mark, and Luke would be almost identical. Whereas what we have now is simply very similar. We can't help but be shaped by the world around us. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it's something that we need to pay attention to. Because sometimes we're shaped by the world around us in ways that can cause us to sin. For instance, working so hard, being driven is an American ideal. Hard work is rewarded, to the point where workaholism has only recently begun to be called out and said, hey, it's great that you want to work hard, but if you're here so much that you're never with your family, that's a problem. This is a recent thing that we've begun to really focus on. But we still reward hard work above all else. And that's just an example. We have to always be aware of the yeast of the world around us, the sin of the world that can infect our lives. Because it's not enough to simply go through life and say, well, I've got Jesus, that's enough. It's never enough. We are always to be pursuing holiness. God is always drawing us to be more like his Son. And that requires us to heed Jesus' warning. Beware the sin of the world. Because if it gets in you, it will infect you. And will spread all throughout you. And corrupt you. And change you. And that's what we have to do. Keep our eyes open. Pay attention to when behavior that the world deems as normal actually goes against godly things. Not everything the world does is bad, but most of it is. And if we're not paying attention, we'll begin behaving like that and adopting those behaviors without realizing it. This warning by Jesus to his disciples and to us is that we have to pay attention. You know, I don't hold it by the other end. But if you think about it, the chainsaw is one of the most dangerous pieces of equipment we've ever made. But it's also one of the most helpful tools that we have. And when you use a chainsaw, I hope you're not using it with your eyes shut. I hope your eyes are open when you're cutting down a tree, paying attention to how it's falling. I hope you're paying attention as you're driving a car. Probably one of the other dangerous things that we've ever created, considering that we can get those things out to 80 miles an hour without trying. Pay attention to the sin of the world, because it will infect you if it gets a chance. Satan will use the world's sin to harm us, hamper us, and slow us down if he gets a chance. So pay attention. Go to God in humility, because he is always quick. We cannot remove yeast from a dough once it's incorporated. We cannot remove sin from our hearts. It is impossible with us. But with God, anything is possible. God can remove sin from our hearts, yeast from the bread, and make us holy again. But it requires humility to admit when we have a pattern of behavior that has been incorporated into our lives, something we must open our eyes to and seek forgiveness for and God's help to remove. Now, instead of praying to close the sermon time out, I want to transition straight into communion today. So as we move to communion, as we head this way, I want you to think critically and carefully about sin that we have in our lives today, because we all still sin. We are waiting for Christ to return to finalize us and perfect us. And so as we come to the Lord's table today, let us confess that sin to God in our private prayer, in our quiet prayer that we always open with. And then I would encourage you, find someone you trust, someone who won't judge you or hold it against you, and confess that sin to them too. Because only through confessing sin to both God and each other that we can truly find the help that we need.